Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? You should check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Pictorum Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. Instead of a boring old tie, get him a historic baseball photo taken by Henry High Sandham at the historic Polo Grounds Stadium in New York City during the 1894 Temple Cup. Or, if he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL poster. These are so good looking that you'll be amazed how they turn out. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order.
On October 2nd, 1959, the television show Twilight Zone was first aired, causing viewers of the show to join a journey that seemed surreal for the characters in each episode. 9 days later, Upton Bell would be placed into his own Twilight Zone because his father, Bert Bell, would end up passing away on October 11th right in front of him. And it happened in what could have easily been an episode of the Twilight Zone, because he was watching his two former teams play on the same field where he led the Pennsylvania Quakers to their only Rose Bowl game. And the big twist at the end of all this is that in a few days, Bert Bell would have been named the owner of the Eagles.
Welcome to the Football History Dude podcast, where each episode is a journey back in time to learn about the rich history of the NFL. Your host is Arnie Chapman. Football is his passion, and he wants you to come along with him to explore the yesteryear of the gridiron. So hop on board his DeLorean and let's get this baby up to 88 miles per hour.
Great Scott!
This time as we step off our DeLorean, the date is October 11th, 1959, and we still have a passenger riding shotgun with us. His name is Upton Bell. The reason why we stopped at this time is because this is the day his father passed away, and like I said in the intro, it was basically a Twilight Zone episode that had happened to him that day, because we found out in the last episode that Bert Bell had plans to purchase the Philadelphia Eagles just a few days later, and retire as a commissioner, which probably would have led to Upton being an owner of the Eagles in the future. However, the deal fell through, and Upton was on his own, and he had some decisions to make. This is where we start off this part of the interview. But before we get there, I wanted to remind you this is part 2 of the Upton Bell interview. And if you have not listened to part 1, then I highly suggest you go ahead and check that one out first. And you can get there through your podcast player or by heading to thefootballhistorydude.com/Upton Bell. And while you're at it, I ask that you please subscribe for free to this show by mashing that little subscribe button on your podcast player of choice. That way you get the hottest, freshest off the press episodes each and every week. But for now, let's go ahead and figure out what Upton did after his father passed away. Upton Bell, he's got to find his way on his own. What is he going to do after the Eagles? Where did you go?
Well, I began that long trip, and probably 10 of the greatest years I spent in that Carol Rosenblum, who owned the Colts, very controversial, was actually offering me. I went to meet with him in Atlantic City. He had a home there as well as Baltimore and in New York. And ironically, my father talked him into bringing the old Colts back to Baltimore. And Rosenblum was against it. And he said, listen, be the best investment you'll ever make. I'm only asking for $30,000. Of course, we know what it's worth now. So he bought the team. And my father said to him one time, I'd like a piece of that for my kids. Well, of course, that never worked out. But Rosenblum, who was Joe Kennedy's great friend and business partner, I went to visit him in Atlantic City in 1960, and we watched the convention from L.A. when JFK was nominated and became the presidential candidate. And Rosenblum had been out there with Teddy Kennedy. And actually, Rosenblum, as I talk about in the book, said, the president, JFK and Bobby Kennedy aren't the best politician. He said the best politician is Teddy Kennedy. He said he's too young now. He said, but he's going to end up being the best politician. And so we had this long conversation. He said, listen, in August, now remember, they had won back-to-back championships. The sudden death game, which made pro football, 59, they win again. And he said, you go to training camp. It's your last year of college. when you finish college next year, come back. And of course, again, people travel everywhere today. Kids go to Europe, they go everywhere. So you got to remember, it's 1960. It's the first time really leaving home on my own. Even though I traveled all over the country with my father, you get in a car and you drive from Philadelphia to Baltimore and you think, you know what? I'll never be home again. And I never was. In fact, kind of the sad part of it is that as a family, after my father died that year, never again together as a family. So think about a kid, 22 years old, getting a car, driving down there, not knowing what his future is, and ending up going to the Colts training camp for the summer, which was a fabulous thing. I learned a lot, and then came back the following year. And of course, still, I think everybody talks about Brady. Different time, I understand, but I still think Unitas was the greatest quarterback I've ever seen. He and Brady would be my top two ones. But those 10 years there, Big Daddy Lipscomb, Art Donovan, Gino Marchetti, who just died, Lenny Moore, still one of the greatest athletes I've ever seen. These were the legendary Colt teams in a town where time had stopped still. That it was middle America. It was, everything was around the Colts. All life revolved around it. The players in those days, they played, but they also went to work. They played the game on Sunday. All of them had jobs. And so they were part of the fabric of Baltimore. Blue collar, in love with their team, and they loved their players because Unitas and Marchetti, a lot of them, they were dock wallopers. They worked on the docks. They worked in the steel mills. This is one of the greatest football teams of all time. You ain't getting anybody, you're not going to get any Rob Gronkowski to get out and work with the steel workers. But that was that bond, that love that you'll never see again. And so that a young boy who grew into being a man who and eventually ran the NFL draft, I think I was the youngest person in history to run the Colts draft under Don Shula, who then went on to become one of the greatest coaches in history. But that 10 years, which is in the book, and there's tragedy in there too. There's the death of the president. There's the tragic death of Big Daddy Lipscomb, who was one of the best athletes I've ever seen. He was so good, he played with the Harlem Globetrotters in the offseason. 6'4", 6'5", 295, so he could have played today easily. Just all these amazing characters who happen to be great football players. A rougher game, a harder time. The players today are bigger, quicker, stronger, faster. I'm not sure that they're better than what I saw because there weren't 32 teams. So every week you played the Packers, you played the Lions, you played the Cleveland Browns, Jimmy Brown. You played teams that were really good every week. You didn't get these stiffs that you have that the Patriots play in their own conference. So it was a harder game. People, really got hit on every play. The quarterbacks, everybody. But again, that town, that team, those players, I guess the closest you could come to it, if Arnie, if you've seen it, and I recommend it to all people. If you want to know Baltimore, see the movie Diner, which was made by a young director who used to come to Colt practices. And Diner's all about the dedication and love of the Colts around these people who grew up and went to the diner that I used to go to, the Fells Point Diner, at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. I say it's on Turner Classic Movies occasionally. See or rent or go on YouTube and see Diner. And that will tell you the story of the Baltimore I grew up in.
Yeah, we'll have to take a look at that, and I'll even see if I can't put a link of that on the show notes too as well. Totally different world. I've told you before, I'm a young dude compared to you, and I have never lived in a time where the NFL players have dealt with basically what it was like before, let's call it before the 70s. I know no NFL before the 90s, really. So it's unfair for me to compare any generation that I've grown up to any generation in the past.
Well, and you know what, Arnie, and it's hard And I tell people when in my book I have Unitas and Brady as the two best. And I said in two different eras, I said Unitas have a field day today because basically the defense is penalized all the time. I said conversely, Brady would have a hard time then, even though he's big, 6'5". I said, but Brady isn't hit on every play. Unitas got hit on every play. Unitas was a cripple at the end of his life. Total cripple from the beating he took. So you're right, it was different. But again, remember, and I talk about this in the book, Gino Marchetti, who just died, he would have been great in any era. He, at the age of 17, fought the Battle of the Bulge. Art Donovan fought the Battle of Midway. These are guys who came back from the Second World War and knew what death was like. And I think that besides their own abilities, if you're in something and you see people die, and you see your friends die, and you've got to kill people. Concrete Chuck Bednarik of the Eagles. At the age of 17, he was a bomber. Flew in the back of those B-29 bombers over Germany. At the age of 17, he was a tail gunner. So, they faced death. They knew what it was. Are the players better today? Sure. I'm not sure the game's better, but the players are better. Technically and otherwise, the diets. But think about being around those people. I was really around them. Sure, they could act like boys at times, but these were people that faced the worst thing we can all face is death. So I have a respect for them, regardless of whether they were as good as the players today are there. I have respect for them because they saw the reality of life. They came back and made another life for themselves to become the greatest of their generation. There is a reason why Tom Brokaw had that best-selling book, The Greatest Generation. Now, I think every generation, I think the kids that go to war today are as great as the kids that did the 30s, 40s, whatever it is. But there is something about those people that will always stick in my mind. No celebrations after you score a touchdown. The old Bill Parcells routine telling his players in the early 2000s, when you score a touchdown, act like you've been there. I mean, you tackle somebody today and they act like it's an orgasm. I'm saying, Jesus, all he did is tackle somebody. If you were to do that, even back in Steve Grogan's era, the 90s, if you were to do that, the player would walk over and say, you do that again and I'll punch your lights out. I mean, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, and speaking of act like you've been there, you're an individual that has been there around the NFL for so long. And with the Colts organization, going from, what was it, water boy, towel boy, equipment boy, all the way to director of player personnel, how did that story go?
Well, again, you have to be at the right place at the right time. I was lucky. I started out in 1963. I went in and said, you know what? I know a lot about football. I was working at a ticket office. If you need a scout, let me know. So they decided to be in the scouting department because the scouting departments weren't big then. And they sent me out on the road. They said, here are a lot of brochures. Here are the schools you need to go to. And so I started, and I'm probably going to look at doing a second book somewhere along the line, just on my travels throughout America in the early 60s all the way through, to the middle 70s. And so that's where I started out and saw everything from, being near the bridge in Selma the day that Martin Luther King and many African Americans were beaten and gassed on the famous bridge in Selma. I had many cases where people threatened to kill me because I looked like this young white kid from the north who was maybe coming, in their opinion, to the South to register African Americans to vote. Very dangerous time. But I saw it all. But the break I got in 1964 was in San Francisco because we were on the road. And my boss, the personnel director, had a heart attack. And Shula turned to me. It was his second year. And he said, "Kid, you ready to take over?" I said, "I'm ready." And my first draft, I convinced him to take Mike Curtis from Duke, who was actually running back. I said he'll be a great linebacker someday, and I believe that he belongs in the Hall of Fame. And my second pick was Ralph Neely, who ended up going to Dallas because we couldn't sign him because of the war between the two leagues. I then drafted Al Atkinson, who played against us in the Jets Super Bowl game that we blew. Marty Schottenheimer went on to become a great... My first 6 draft choices all played in the NFL, and one of them belongs in the Hall of Fame. So I got lucky, and then a year later, I was in Dallas for spring practice, and I got a call from Baltimore and said that your personnel director, your boss, just dropped dead. Came back to Baltimore, went in and told Shula, I know, I'm just a kid, but I called the owner, Rosenblum, and I said, give me a chance. If I'm no good, fire me. But give me a chance. And I talked them both into it, and the rest is history.
And just to remind the listeners, Rosenblum, he was the owner of the Colts at the time, right?
Somebody who was a brilliant guy. He played football at Penn. But his biggest problem was, we sent more general managers and more personnel people on from the Colts than any other team in history, including Dallas. George Young became general manager of the New York Giants. I became a general manager of the New England Patriots. Harry Humes became a general manager of the New Orleans Saints. Ernie Accorsi became a general manager of the Browns and the New York Football Giants. We had Dick Szymanski also. We had 5 or 6 people go right from that organization that I was in right to becoming general managers, and then other ones to personnel directors. Rosenblum's biggest problem, which you read in the book, is he liked to gamble. And although they never caught him, there's always been suspicions about it. And I wonder if my father had lived, whether he would have had to banish him from the league. But you look at Rosenblum and you look at what's going on with Bob Kraft now, and you say to yourself, because I'm sure they want him to be in the Hall of Fame eventually, who belongs in the Hall of Fame? There's so many things going on here, but Rosenblum is a real character. You read about him in the book. Whether he gambled, but he was a Howard Hughes type of character. There are a lot of characters in this book. I mean, there's another character, Sammy Goldstein, who was a friend of Sinatra's. I met Sinatra in Baltimore. And Sammy Goldstein, in those days, everybody could hang out. Sammy Goldstein, I'm sure, was a gangster. And then I had another person who pretended like he was going to buy into the Charlotte Hornets, and he found out that he was under an assumed name, stole a jet, flew to Charlotte, said he was going to give me a check for $100,000 to save the team. And I found out later that he was in the witness protection program, and that he was talked off the Verrazano Bridge in New York because he was going to commit suicide because he didn't want to be knocked off by the mafia. So there are plenty of great stories in the book for people.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, there's no way we can cover everything in this podcast episode.
No.
The book definitely is going to be recommended 100%, and I loved reading through it. I couldn't put it down, and again, we will be pushing that forward on to everybody out there in the show notes with some links. Speaking of the book, in the Hall of Fame, you mentioned Eddie Kotal, and I might be pronouncing that wrong, the first full-time scout.
No, you got it right. Now, I'll tell you something, Arnie, and I'm glad you brought up his name, because I've tried to get the attention of the Hall of Fame and saying the one person that belongs in over everybody was the person who really invented scouting, and that's Eddie Kotal of the Rams, who was the first person to go out on the road in the 40s, kept track of people, and actually was one of the first to scout African Americans at Grambling. He belongs in there, but these people, they don't know. They're going to vote on the top 100 players of this year for the 100th anniversary. And I called one of my friends, Ernie Accorsi. I said, I know more than any of those people on that committee, and none of them have seen the great players from the 60s back. I said, they're going to vote on them? I said, are you kidding? But I've been trying to get Eddie Kotal in because I think he belongs in there. He was the original guy. He was the one that discovered all the great players with the Rams. Rams had so many good players, they traded half of them away, like Big Daddy Lipscomb. He found him at Pendleton, a Marine base in Pendleton, California. Big Daddy Lipscomb. no college, nothing. And if he'd lived long enough, he would have been in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. But he definitely belongs in there. And every time I tell them, they don't pay any attention.
Is Eddie Kotel still alive?
No, God, he died years ago.
Oh, okay. So you mentioned Ernie Accorsi, and we've talked about other GMs that have gone on from the Colts organization, but we didn't really talk about Super Bowl III, and let's call it a letdown if you want, but I'm sure it was a little bit more than that as far as your team went.
Well, it's a great chapter because it takes, I don't know, it's 20, 30 pages, more than that. It's really the biggest upset in pro football history, and it made, in the end, even though we lost, it made both leagues equal because we were 18-point favorite, and the great line by Jimmy Orr, our great receivers, said about Earl Morrall, who had taken over for Unitas when he got hurt, said, I hope Earl doesn't wake up today. And he did wake up. He had a bad day, and we blew. And it wasn't Joe Namath that won that Super Bowl. It was Matt Snell in their running game. Why I picked Weeb Eubank as one of the great coaches in history, although his record would not, recommend him for that. He had the two greatest games in history. The sudden death game in New York that he won the Colts, and the upset of us after he got fired by Cal Rosenblum when the Jets beat us. But we go through page by page how that game happened and what happened to the league after that.
Yeah, that was a very interesting chapter for me to read as well. I've, again, being from a younger, newer generation, in my mind, it was the Joe Namath game until I read the book and saw what really happened, or, was able to understand the dynamic of Weeb Eubank. I had no idea Don Shula, Weeb Eubank, and the relationship that was there between the two coaches of Super Bowl III. And just interesting for someone like me to be able to dive deep into that topic.
Well, for anybody, it's a diagram of a game that we should have won very easily, but lost for certain key reasons and had nothing to do in many ways with Joe Namath, except Namath gave them the courage by saying all of the stuff before the game, will kill them and all this other stuff. And I guess, got his team to believe in him. But again, it's the luck of life. I mean, we had 4 different opportunities in the first half to score and blow the game open, and fumbles and balls going in the air, and Earl Morrall missing a wide open Jimmy Orr in the end zone. All of that crazy stuff. And even that whole day was crazy. Nixon and Agnew had won, and Agnew was a great friend of the team, flew down on our plane, and Agnew comes in to me before the game, and he said, Nixon wants to give Don Shula the first play. I said, are you kidding me? I said, I'd like to go and tell Shula that. Shula take my head off. And Joe Kennedy came to the game, and Teddy came to the game because they were close with Rosenblum. It was going to be a big party, a big celebration. It turned out to be the biggest upset in history.
Yeah, and you also mentioned how, even though it was premature, Rosenblum had invited Weeb Eubanks to the after party before the game even started. How did that go?
Yep. No, Weeb didn't show up. But the Kennedys did, and other people did, Roselle did. But it was an embarrassment for the NFL, and it was an embarrassment for Rosenblum. And because we lost, that was how Doug Shula ended up in Miami, because Rosenblum never forgave Shula for losing that game and embarrassing him. And Shula never was the same with Rosenblum. If that hadn't happened, Shula would have remained the rest of his life in Baltimore. But that's, again, what this book says, Arnie, and whether it's sports or not, you got to be at the right place at the right time. Anything can happen in your life. Some of the dumbest things you think happen end up costing you a lot. So that's what happened. One game finished Rosenblum and Shula's relationship, and Shula ended up going to Baltimore.
Yeah, and that was one of the questions I wanted to ask you is, alternate reality, what do you think would have happened to the league because of the AFL-NFL merger if the Jets had lost that game and the Colts won it, beyond just Shula becoming the coach and staying the coach at the Colts?
Well, I think it'd have been fine. It might have delayed another year because you forget the next year Kansas City beat Minnesota. That was the last year before the total merger. So eventually it would have worked out. It's just that game everybody remembers because we were such overwhelming favorites.
Yeah, it's kind of like when the for me, thinking modern time, the Eagles, Nick Foles beating the Patriots, even though it didn't turn out, morale didn't win that time. Do you think Nick Foles could be like the modern day Eddie Morale?
Well, it could be. I think Foles had a great day, but I think for one of the few times that Belichick blew it, he didn't play his best defensive back. Nobody will ever find out what really happened or why. And I think the other thing is, remember, our defense, Patriots, were really bad. I wasn't surprised that the Eagles were that way. Other people were. I was. Brady threw for 501 yards and they still lost.
Right, yeah. I mean, going into it, they were maybe favored heavily because of being the Patriots, but on paper, and if you look at the roster personnel and things like that, it was probably a lot more close than really what it was.
It was. It absolutely was. And the key play, like the key play in the 68 game, Morrill misses on the flea flicker, misses Jimmy Orr waving his hands in the end zone. He completes the pass, which should have been easily. We go on to blow them out. If Nick Foles and that play just before halftime, where they're down there and they go for it, and they have the reverse and fool them, and they score the touchdown just before halftime, I said that's the game.
Oh yeah, if that didn't momentum go forward into it, then things could have totally went the other way. But speaking of the other way, Super Bowl V, they did finally get that victory, but it wasn't as sweet as it could have been, was it?
No, and most of our players will say, even to this day, the ones that are still alive, that we never got over losing that Super Bowl III. And in Super Bowl V, it was called the Blooper Bowl. We won the game because we fumbled less than Dallas did, and won on a field goal by Jim O'Brien. And Mike Curtis made the interception on a deflected ball. But again, it's never the same when remember, we only lost one game. We could have been unbeaten. We might have been the only unbeaten team in history. Forget the Patriots in 2007 when they lost the Super Bowl. If we hadn't put John Unitas back in the third or fourth game of the year against Cleveland, which we beat 34-0 in the championship game, if not, we would have been going into the Super Bowl fully unbeaten. And if we had won the Super Bowl, we would have been the first modern team. Now, Shula did it back in 1972. But again, we're back to what do we always keep coming back to in the conversation? The big ifs of life.
Yeah, it's just very interesting how we always talk about soccer ball, basketball, baseball. For the most part, you kind of know where they're going to bounce. But when that football's in the air, man, we don't know what's going to happen. And just in the blink of an eye. And I'm going to let you go ahead and say what your father quoted as far as what can happen on a Sunday.
I wish at the time, although my brother finally protected it legally, I wish that, and most people didn't know it until my father's life story came out 7 or 8 years ago. Bert Bell was the one that said, on any given Sunday, gave the quote, I think, to a writer for the Philadelphia Bulletin in 1954-55. He said, on any given Sunday, any team can beat any other team. It is said, I think, almost every day, particularly during the football season, at 10, 20, 30 times a day. And that was his famous quote that people still to this day either get the wrong person. I remember Peter King, Sports Illustrated, called me about it, and I said, Peter, he thought Roselle said it. Peter, no, I said it was Bert Bell. He said, I'm sorry, I'll correct it. But that was the title of my father's life story, his book that came out about 7 years ago. So he just, he had that feel for it. And remember, he made up the schedules unlike today, and he always made sure, and again, that was one of his ideas, schedule the weak against the weak and the strong against the strong through the first 6 or 7 games of the season, keep everybody in the race.
And the purpose of that is so we have parity in the league, so then at the end of or halfway through the season, it's not like a runaway. Is that what the deal was there?
Right, and and particularly in those days, you had to. We wanted to make sure everybody was able to be equal and make money. So it was, one of the things that he had, one of the hallmarks that he had, and that's one of his many famous quotes.
Well, from a personal perspective, going back to the Patriots and then on any given Sunday, I am a modern-day Detroit Lions fan who has never seen anything happen, and I just want them to win one Super Bowl for my grandpa. That's all I ask before he passes away. You think that Patricia has any chance in Bob Quinn over there?
I doubt it. I saw the great Lions teams, and they were all in the 50s. And saw, when they had Buddy Parker and Bobby Lane and Doak Walker, and even through Alex Karras into the 60s. And, they had some great teams. But then it just has never, ever worked out. Detroit was still is, one of the great pro football towns in America. But the Martha Firestone's still alive, Bill Ford's wife, and I don't know. Remember, the Lions were great before we got into all this parity, and now anybody can win, as Bert Bell said, on any given Sunday. Yeah, but because I can remember the great days, and I was there for championship games and knew many of your greatest players. But we'll see. I have my doubts.
Yeah, I'm sure, and as most do. I tell you what, I drink the blue Kool-Aid every offseason, then I get disappointed. Normally around halfway through it goes, but I hold out hope every time, and one of these days we're going to get it.
I hope you're right. It's a great place. By the way, I want to tell the people to read Bob Ryan, who's on the back of my book, a great writer on the NBA, recommended it too. Read the epilogue. I wrote the epilogue myself. Goes about 35 pages, and it's all the things I couldn't get in the book, but there's fascinating stories in there, including my friend George Raveling, who went on to coach Southern Cal and teams out on the West Coast, basketball player. He and I played in the Summer League together in Philadelphia, and he's the one that went down when he was a college student at Villanova, went down for the Martin Luther King speech in Washington Monument. And at the end of the speech, he was standing behind King, and he said to King, "Can I have the speech?" And King handed him the original speech. He now has it hidden in a bank somewhere, and people have offered him millions of dollars for the speech. So there are a lot of interesting things. Read the epilogue when you get the book.
Oh, yes, for sure. I recommend that to everybody out there. Let's just say the entire book is like a marathon of golden knowledge nuggets, but then you think you're at the end and it's awesome, but you get to the epilogue and it's one of those deals where you can't put it down to even go to the restroom. It's just an incredible wealth of interesting and facts and things like that in the back there. Speaking of one of them, I saw in the book that you had a chance to meet Muhammad Ali at the after party for Super Bowl V. Did you really talk to him that much, or was it more of a passing by? Oh, you know it. You're going to have to wait until next week to hear what Upton has to say about Muhammad Ali. And once again, you sure know that he did drop those doggone golden knowledge nuggets that I keep talking about, going into stories about the Colts and what they meant to the city of Baltimore, unlike anything I personally have ever heard. A different time, a different era, a different kind of professional football player. And I included an Amazon link to Upton's book, Present at the Creation, on his dedicated page on the site. To check his book out and learn more about Upton Bell, you can head to thefootballhistorydude.com/Upton Bell. Again, that's thefootballhistorydude.com/Upton Bell. Now next week, we are going to finish Upton Bell's story, getting an overview of what he did after working with the great Johnny Unitas and Don Shula. But for now, dudes, I'm through if you're through.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Football History Dude. To make sure you're the first to get the next episode, please subscribe on your podcast player of choice and head on over to thefootballhistorydude.com for the show notes and more information on the history of the NFL. And remember, dudes, where we're going, we don't need roads.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.